So we go.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris, for inviting me to the Society of Community Research and Action Scholars. And you mentioned that you were going to have your group introduce themselves, and that would be wonderful.
Great, great. Maybe I could just call you out so we don't have the awkward pause. Shauna, do you want to lead off? You're muted. Yeah.
Hi there. Yes. Hi, Leonard. My name is Shauna Leek. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Virginia. I'm not sure what else we're doing to introduce ourselves. And this is Amari. He's just hanging out down here, talking and fussing.
So cute. Great, thanks. Mita?
Hi, I'm Mita Banerjee. I'm an assistant professor in clinical community psychology over at University of South Carolina.
Great, nice to meet you.
Josie?
Hi there, I'm Josie Bañales, and I'm an assistant professor at UIC in the community and prevention research area.
Great, nice to meet you.
Yeah. Natalie?
Hey, I'm Natalie Kibble, assistant professor at the Wilfrid Laurier University program up in Canada.
Great, thank you.
So
I think we have one last person that just joined us.
No, that's Shauna.
Oh, okay. So that's got it. Okay, just that went.
Right.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for giving me a chance to spend a couple of minutes with you all. I'm going to share my screen. And I've just put together a couple slides so I could zip through some of my thoughts on this. Really, it's talking about creating roles for research coordinators in their research labs. And I think there are 4 issues that I thought of as I this particular issue. One is selection. How does one select people? How does one then manage them? What's the infrastructure of support for those people? And are there some overall social justice and personal objectives that maybe provide a larger context for the individuals that we might hire and supervise? So in terms of selection, I hired my first project director when I received my first NIMH grant in 1980. So it really goes back over 40 years. And I was fortunate to be able to hire a person who I actually knew pretty well. She was just graduated the clinical community program at DePaul. Some of you probably know her. Her name is Ann Bogat, and she's a professor at Michigan State, as you know. So I think my initial thoughts back then was that really anybody could do this job, and that you basically select someone, and if you can do it, they can do it. And I think if you're lucky, that kind of works out fine. And if you have, certainly, with Ann Bogat, I had a strong positive relationship with her for a number of years. So I knew her, so that made a good connection. And I knew a lot about her and her working style. But that's probably not always the case. It's more likely that you'll end up hiring somebody for senior positions or even junior positions in your lab that you have minimal experience with, except for your interview, which is a very short, awkward situation, and then by looking at their letters of recommendation. So if you hire a person who you don't know, these are some issues that I think you might need to think about. Community research is frequently very fast changing, and the situations that you deal with are different, almost on a daily basis. A person who can adapt quickly to those changes is probably going to be a more effective leader in your lab. And the problem is, how do you find out how creative the person is when you don't really have a working relationship with them? So what I would suggest is, if you can sample their behaviors, sample their styles before that, and that could occur by certainly the letters of recommendation or talking to their supervisors. But the best way to find out how a person functions is by actually observing it yourself. And I think that usually within 2 or 3 weeks after you've hired a person, you have an idea of whether that might actually have worked out well. So one exercise that you can try, that I sometimes do, is give the person a situation during your interview to see how they actually deal with some of these creativity issues. So one example is, you have 2 cities on 2 ends of a cliff, and you have a bridge that needs to be built across because it's a valley that separates these 2 cities. When you put together a bridge, what are some of the issues to think about? Now, there are some people who give you one response and say, well, make it a sturdy bridge with good materials. But there's other people who are going to give you 10 different issues that they have to think about to sort of actually get buy-in from different groups to make sure this bridge is the right one. So that's an example of somehow you can actually see their problem-solving prowess. And if you can do that, you have a better sense of what they might be like when they're actually working with you. Another thing is that you might have a particular problem that you're trying to deal with, and you could share it with them and see how they would respond to it. And that will give you another idea when you deal with the tougher things. Now, certainly you want to have a person who has good interpersonal skills, to the extent they can create a sense of community, bring staff together to deal with daily issues that come up. That's actually a very positive thing. And I don't have to say much more about DEI strengths today. You certainly want people who are sensitive to this and will promote these values in your work setting to be successful. Once you've hired a person, you have another set of issues dealing with management. And I think management can be a very easy process if you pick a person who is easy to work with and you have the simpatico values around these issues. But there's lots of issues that can go wrong over time, particularly if you select a person you don't know well. And for me, the biggest issue I've noticed is the difference between policy versus implementation. That when a person comes aboard, they actually want to show you that they can be very effective. And you give them often many different things to work on because that relieves your responsibilities. But as you do that, they basically often, there's like almost a gray line between a gray region between when is it that they want to be talking to you about things and when do they want to just be implementing something that you've already agreed to. And that's a blurry line because ultimately in a lot of the community projects you're dealing with, there could be hundreds of things that are being worked on. And you can't talk about all of them because you don't have time. So you, in a sense, have to figure out what are the critical things and what are the things that are no longer important because you've got a resolution. And having a discussion about that frequently in a positive way is very helpful because it's so easy to get that wrong. And if it does get wrong and the person starts feeling that they're dealing with policy issues and you're feeling that they're not checking with you, that can lead to all types of disagreements and really can undermine the relationship you're trying to develop with that staff person. Of course, in management, you want to provide them respect. You want to provide them encouragement. And that's without saying. But again, it's much easier to look at what hasn't been done and what needs to be done than to basically focus on the positive. And I think we all like to get rewarded and like to get praised for the things that we do, to the extent that we have some gratitude for our own status and privilege that we have. We can certainly try to extend that to the people we work with. And one of the things that we have to offer people in management to get them hooked into really trying to work cooperatively with the staff and ourselves is that we can provide them professional development. So when you bring people aboard, you're often not going to be able to pay them the same salaries that they might be able to get outside of academic settings. So the question is, what can we give them that they can't get in other situations? And I do think that one of the things that we can give them are opportunities to network, meet other people through our connections, and to be very active in doing that at different like regional conferences or eco community site conferences. And we can also help them with getting their name on stuff. And as we know, that's something good for their own professional development going forward. I also want to mention that the setting that you're in will have a tremendous influence on the type of work that goes on between you and your research coordinators or your project director or any of your staff. If your setting provides you adequately staffed and competent people, that will make your life and the people you hire much easier. There's a tendency going on in all business and academic settings for there to be silos, which means increasing competence within human resources, human relations, within sponsored programs, within payroll, within financial affairs, so that each of these groups begins to develop more and more procedures that involve sign-offs. And sometimes there's multiple sign-offs even between one entity. And sometimes these silos need to get permission from other silos to have something enacted on. What you really hope is that there's someone in your setting who's a boundary spanner. And that means not yourself, but someone in administration. Because if you don't have these boundary spanners, you're going to spend your time doing the work that someone who really should be paid should be doing within your university. And to the extent you're in a setting that is deprived of these basic interstitial connections, you will end up in a depleted sense of your mission because you'll be spending too much of your time on trying to get things done rather than actually your project. And that will then create all types of stressors for your entire staff, including your project coordinator. Now, indirects are supposed to pay. Yes.
Could you give an example? Conceptually, I follow you, but it'd be interesting to know in particular how this manifests.
So if for example, you're trying to hire somebody, or if you're trying to, for example, basically look at your finances and the grant has basically paid the person for the wrong account, or you can't hire a person because it involves 10 signatures and you can't get them. And if you have to do that work, you can spend an inordinate amount of time trying to do those tasks that should not be part of your responsibilities. And if you're doing those things, it's distracting you from the work that you need to be doing as a community psychologist, academic, or anything else that you're working on. And it's, again, something that needs to be considered. And indirects, which are the money that basically the grants bring into the university, sometimes they can be like 50%. So you could have $1 million grant and the university gets $500,000. If your university doesn't put that $500,000 into supporting the things that you need, then they're not doing their job. And that needs to be challenged, or you need to find a setting that will allow you to have that happen. And this situation can improve or deteriorate over time. And this is why leadership within our systems that we're talking about is so important. Because if you don't have the right leadership in your setting, you will then be, in a sense, have your arm tied behind your back as you're trying to be effective. And this will put a strain on your entire project. If you do have appropriate leadership, you will be able to navigate through this process in a much more effective way. Finally, what are the overall objectives of your setting? Clearly, social justice is the things that I think binds us together into the types of things we're all interested in. We want to bring about social change in all the different manifestations. We know that this is a more difficult time with a very reactionary movement occurring not only in this country, at the local and national levels, but many different countries. So that creates more headwind for the types of change we might want to make within our settings or our particular projects. So it's more important than ever to create environments that provide support for your staff, because these alien environments of policy we're going to have effects on the types of work that we do. So I'm going to conclude my comments, brief as they are, with personal objectives that you and your staff might want to think about. Often in our work, we feel like we're on a perilous voyage at times. I almost think about kind of the great myths. And sometimes in those voyages, we feel completely on our own with minimal resources, because we might get the grant, we might hire the people, but we're the people who has to write the reports to basically guarantee that the money we're getting is being spent appropriately. Sometimes we feel like kind of Ibsen's Peer Gynt, peeling an onion, where there's so many layers to get to the kernel. And maybe they're only layers that keep getting smaller. Just kind of for those of you who are familiar with that play. In a sense, you and I and others are entering a forest in our work where it's often darkest. And in a sense, we're in search for what might be called the Holy Grail. Our work is filled with unanticipated dangers, as well as exhilarating moments that can provide us new insights for solving some of the social problems that we're dealing with. Ultimately, I do think that in our work and the people that we hire at different levels, we want to basically allow all of us to find that deepest sense of harmony, the mystery that captures your imagination and holds it so time passes without it being noticed. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenny. Helpful thoughts. So people have comments or reflections on the thoughts?
I have
I
a
do.
question.
go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. Shauna, you want to go first?
Sure. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you mentioned like the indirect costs or what like grants administrators or the folks at your university can help you do, is that just a conversation that we should have to say like, oh, what part of this can you all assist with, or what part of this process? Or is there, I guess some institutions are there like lists of like, oh, we help with this X, Y, and Z.
So I would say that on the websites of your institutions, And it could be an Office of Research Services, Office of Sponsored Programs. It has different names, different settings, but there should be personnel there that basically lists the functions that they do. And they're actually pretty extensive. If you don't have the expertise, if you don't have the functioning, you will end up potentially having significant problems. I'll give you one example. You have to put together reports if you're submitting something to the federal government. And it could be an NIH progress report. It could be an NIH final report. There's something called an RPPR, which is, needs to be filled out. These things can be 100 pages, incredibly technical details, many of which involve policy that you and I have not been trained to basically understand or even handle. And even if you go into the federal registry to try to figure out what some of these things mean, you might end up, not understanding it and not being clear. And when you call Washington and you go to the Center for Scientific Review or you go to your institute, they often are pretty busy and they're not able to provide you even the answers. So if you have someone within sponsored programs that can go through your entire document and make sure that you have actually been compliant with all the questions they ask, that is critically important. So you cannot basically be responsible for knowing an entire different job that basically someone should be paid to do. If you have to do that, that takes not only your time, but it also pushes you away from your level of competence. So in your research and your work and your community interventions, you want to stay with your area of competence. You don't want to be going into doing someone else's job. And if you're doing someone else's job, that means someone else isn't doing it. And if they're not doing it, that is an incredible barrier. And I would say there's probably 100 things that need to be done. And you are not trained, nor do you want to be trained to basically do all of those things that are really specialties within, for example, sponsored programs. But I could say the same thing for hiring. And I could say the same thing for payroll. And I could say the same thing for benefits. And we could go on with all the different issues that needs expertise. In a sense, you want a team of people to be working on these issues so that you don't have to do them. And the reality is the grants that you're getting have indirects that should go back to the university to provide these types of supports and services. And if they don't, then that's a major problem.
On that cheery note, this is what they don't tell you when they say you need to get grants, right?
And the other thing that, it's a good point, Chris, and that is, when you're applying for a job or negotiating with your chairperson, or bringing a person in, part of what you're doing is being upfront with them for yourself and your staff. I'll give you an example. If you're hiring somebody who is used to having a certain amount of respect and services and an office and a telephone and where they can have some privacy, and you're going to try to now advertise the job and bring them to your setting, and you're going to give them a cubicle without any supports, that's a major shift for them. And they'll come into your setting and immediately it will start off with this kind of say, why didn't you tell me this? Why didn't I know this? Why didn't I? So the infrastructure support is not only important for you, but it's also important for your staff and project coordinators. And that's why discussions with your chairperson, a selection committee that you're on, or if you happen to be looking for another job, these types of infrastructure issues should be a basic part of finding out about the setting. You are community psychologists. When you go into a setting, you go into a neighborhood group, when you go into doing policy work, we should be doing just as much research, as much fact finding. In a sense, you're doing archaeological digging, and that's what we're good at. But you know something? We often say we're going to do that for these other groups that we're working with, but we don't do that same stuff for the groups that we're in. And if we do that at peril.
So, other questions?
Chris, I'm just full of kind of cheery things this morning, aren't I?
Well, it's good to get a sense of reality and what the challenges are as well as the benefits. So, I think, Josie, do you want to ask your question about? Well, any of your questions about? I was thinking of the COVID one, but.
Yeah, I don't know. Have you seen them yet? Lenny, have you seen my questions? I don't know if you got them in advance.
I did. One of them, the third one, I sort of hinted at a little bit in my brief presentation about, what types of things we could provide to people who are kind of within our settings. So if we attract people, I do think that there's lots of stuff we should be trying to provide them. And really, it's an exchange. And to the extent that they're getting stuff. I think the worst thing that we can do is bring a person on board and then not let them kind of fly their wings and go somewhere else when they're ready. And I've seen this happen. I've had project directors where they had staff that were terrific, and they absolutely were terrific. And they'd worked for us for a year and a half, 2 years. And I would say to the junior staff, I said, hey, you're terrific. Why are you staying here? Now, most people don't do that. They kind of say that's kind of self-defeating. Why do you want to have your best people leave? But my philosophy is you need to be thinking about not just your needs of your project, but what's the needs of the people. And if a person comes and works for a project director because they want to get into graduate school, then that should be what we should be focusing on, how to get them prepared for that. And when they're prepared, they're great and they're terrific workers. But for us to not allow them to take that next step because of our needs, I think is a mistake. So that's another kind of tension point that can sometimes occur, because truthfully, there are some settings that keep their personnel for long periods of time. But, I would say, at least in my experience, I have a regular flow of people coming in and coming out. And that's okay, because they're, getting, what they need. Just I think a month ago or 2 months ago, Mohammed Islam, who, had come to my center to work on, chronic illness and post-viral fatigue and COVID and what happens when people don't recover. So we've been working on that for a while. So he'd been here for, I think, about 1.5 years or 2 years, did a terrific job. And a faculty opening came up at Chicago State. He applied for it. And he got it. So, for me, I said, this is terrific. He's leaving. It leaves our projects in shambles, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. So I spent a couple of weeks with the staff and we all tried to figure out how to kind of take over what he's been doing, because the guy is like a genius and he had all these formulas figured out and we're trying to figure out what the hell he did. But fortunately, he stayed connected with us and we're still working with him. But so when you lose someone who's really great, that's a loss to your project, but it's a gain for him. And we need to be thinking about our personnel. And if we just think about our personnel, we forget about our project, then we're going to have a catastrophe. But at the same time, we have to not just think about our project, and we need to think about the needs of our personnel. So truthfully, when I heard Mohammed got this job and he, been telling me about, becoming opening, I was very positive. I said, this is great. And the rest of my staff thought I was crazy. Why are you letting this guy go? I said, because it's the right thing to do. So there is a tension point. And I think these are some of the issues that, we will deal with. Can you remind me what some of your other questions were? And maybe I can try fielding them as well, because I don't have them in front of me. If you happen to.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you answered a lot of them during your presentation and just through other points you've made already. No, that was good. Thank you.
Okay, good. Happy. But they're very thoughtful questions, and I appreciate you bringing them up.
So Lenny, I have a quick question. I apologize for walking away for a second. I had gotten a phone call and I don't know if you answered it, but how do you identify, I know in your presentation, you talked about boundary spanners, and I was trying to understand, like, how would one identify who would be a good boundary spanner and that they would be effective, instead of, us trying to find them and then it doesn't work in the ways that we think would be optimal, especially while managing research lab responsibilities?
So there's two types of boundary spanners, and maybe I was being a little bit abstract when I was thinking about more the university boundary spanners that exist. But you could also say there's boundary spanners in your own lab. And a project coordinator could be a boundary spanner. And truthfully, when you think about it, that's actually would be a great thing if they can do that. It's really a gift. Some people just have it. They really come up to a boulder, an obstacle, and they're thinking about how do we get around it. And when I see people like that, I'm amazed. I say, they just got it. I mean, it's not something, it's so intuitive. And if you witness that, you want to basically bring those folks in. So what does it involve? It often involves thinking creatively, but it also involves really good interpersonal relationships. So if you are in a setting that has multiple things that need to occur, as we know, most of our settings are like that, and someone has a relationship with a person, so they can sort of say, gee, I can call this person, they know me, and I know them. And if I need a favor, I can email them, call them, and we can solve this issue in 5 minutes. That's incredible. And that's when it's working. And when it is not working, you know it, because you just get caught in these silos that basically do not communicate with each other. And then you become the person that has to try to make it work. And truthfully, it's extremely difficult, because as an academic, I don't have the relationships with some of these people that a person in administration would have, because I'm thought of as an academic, professor, a researcher, and there's this whole other group of people out there that are, in a sense, in a network of employees who basically know each other on a different level. Yeah, I mean, so if I have, I think about, if I can use a name, Bob McCarthy, he was at DePaul University for 18 years. And he was director, he was like that boundary spanner. I could call him anytime. He would answer the phone and he would make it work. He would get stuff done. And because he had that ability he had that ability to do that. And that's all I'm saying is that when you find those people, you're very fortunate. And it's really great to be able to work with them. In your own shop, you'll find those people. And then across the university, you'll find those people. And the people that you can hire yourself with the grad students that you can bring on, if they have this quality, fantastic, fantastic. What you often find is that you spend an inordinate amount of time on, dealing with the problems that involve, these types of issues, rather than the creative work that you're really hired to do.
Yeah, oftentimes people in your department will know who do you go to in this office to get things done, who's kind of the person that has those capacities that Lenny's been talking about. So checking with other people who have done the same kind of thing or who have tried to do the same kind of thing is a good strategy. Sometimes there aren't such people. Sometimes you're trying to do something new, or you have a big problem that no one person has a full grasp of, and then you need to get a team together to problem solve, which is a little more of ambitious. And sometimes it's hard to get people to a meeting unless you have, your chair or some authority figure joining you to support you in that regard. As department chair, sometimes I would go to meetings with accountants and people to try to figure out where did this $1 million go that we would be on the hook for if we can't find. So that was one of the interesting kinds of things that I got to do as chair.
And by the way, Chris, I would say that if you can set up your own accounting system where you can have independent analysis of, what you've spent and what you project to spend, so you don't have to be dependent on the university, that's actually a very good thing. But you're not trained to do that. We're not accountants, but truthfully, I would say if you can do that, and if you can set up an Excel sheet, and if you can make projections, and if you could make projections for your whole project, as long as it's going to go, and basically have money coming in, money going out, and you have your own independent records, fantastic. I would strongly encourage you to do that. And we probably don't spend enough time. What I actually do with my project directors, I take them out of that role because I kind of feel it's all like nonsense, and it's not what they're here to do. And I usually find a post BA person who I train up to do it, and then I let them do it so that the project director doesn't have to do it. But I would say in most situations, it's usually a project director that you can train. But here's the problem, to the extent that you don't know how to do it yourself, and that you try to then have other people do it, there's a real barrier there because you're not going to have the same certitude that it's being done correct. And that goes for everything that you do. You can't be an expert in everything. We all know that. So you've got to sort of, in a sense, prioritize and say, what are the critical things you have to have mastery over? And for me, right at the top of the list is budgets.
We have time for another question. I wasn't sure when this this portion is supposed to be done.
Yeah, we're going to 1:15. So
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
Judith's going to join us about then. Yeah.
So I think so we're obviously at a slightly different part of our career than you are, Lenny. And so, you know, this is our first time, at least for me, my first time trying to figure out how to kind of delegate tasks when I used to be the one that was delegated to, in some way or another. And also like the kind of piecemeal way that our grants work. You know, I'm just starting to set up having a granting pool enough to be able to even have some of these conversations. So I guess my question is, you know, how do you kind of prioritize the piece you were talking about in terms of, you know, sorry, a little bit more context. Anybody I hire right now is going to be a student on my research team, right? That's my pool of people, is my master's students and my PhD students, because I have to give them funding for their school and for anyway. So how do you prioritize their learning and their growth, that piece that you're talking about around kind of building, you know, strong scholars that are going to go off and do all of these other things, with also getting things done with the small amount of budget that I'm currently working with? Because I feel like I'm trying to balance that, and I don't know that I'm always figuring out that balance. And you said something like, you know, if you prioritize only personnel, it will be disaster. that was a scary comment for me, because I do believe in prioritizing kind of the personnel and their skill development, but I do also see how that is making things take longer. You know, we're starting projects a little later. We're maybe moving a little slower through the data collection than anticipated, so we've extended a couple of projects. So really, like, how do you balance the well-being, the health, all the other things that these students are doing with their kind of responsibilities as either a project coordinator or even just a team member, somebody who's doing the work with you?
So it's a tough question. I think if we humble ourselves to recognize we're probably making mistakes on a daily basis, and we're probably not doing it the best way, and we're experimenting and we're failing as many times as we're succeeding. So I think the first step in something like this is to forgive yourself. You're not perfect. And once you've done that, you can start forgiving others too. And I think to the extent that we have gratitude for what we're doing, and the very specialness of which we're basically part of, that we then have an opportunity to possibly deal with these impossible situations that we're constantly dealt with. I do think that to the extent that you're able to invest the time in people so that they care about what they're doing, they care about the project, they care about you, then you have that glue that basically makes it possible to get through the really tough times when everything seems to be in disarray. So I would sort of err on focusing on people development, and really trying to, as much as possible, get that person to the point where they're doing things that maybe you once did. To the extent that you can have people who are undergraduates, BAs, master's level, PhD, assume responsibilities that you are doing but could give up. That's fine. You know, I find people who don't have a BA do some things better than I can. And as soon as I find that, I say to myself, fantastic, you do this, I don't have to do it anymore. And if I can keep letting people do it and letting people take over, then you're doing, I think, probably the best type of mentoring, because it's based on relationships. And to the extent those relationships are very strong, and you are investing in that skill building of those individuals, you ultimately will have less that you have to do. to the extent that you come into a setting with people who are inadequately trained and who are being stressed because they're having to do things that they don't know how to do, and then being blamed for things that they can't do successfully, then you're basically talking about how many research labs actually work. And that's regrettable.
Funny. It's a complicated thing that I've been chewing on for a while. So that gives me one part of the puzzle, I think, as I kind of work my way through it, but I appreciate it.
Sure.
One thing that Lenny's very good at is, admitting graduate students who have interest in his work. So there's a real overlap between the projects that they work on for him and what they do for their theses or dissertations or comprehensive projects. And that really helps. I'm not as effective in that regard and tend to have a broad array of folks. But when I was at UIC and working with Fabricio, we also had a team that used the work we were doing for their major projects, and that worked quite well.
Yeah, I mean, when I interview someone who's an undergraduate or has a BA or master's or PhD, probably the most important question for me is, what do they want to do? What's important to them? What's going to get them excited? And what's going to be something that they can be committed to? And to the extent that that overlaps with some of the things I'm interested in, that's great. But if I give them something to work on that they're not interested in, or it's just going to be, something that they're being assigned to do, it's not in their best interest. They can learn some good research skills, but it's just such more gratifying when they're actually in an area that they think they might even want to go into. And one of our problems in our field is that we have so many people who jump from one thing to another, and they don't really kind of stick with things. And I think that's hard, because with community relations and with the types of things that we care about with our community groups we're working with, we really want those enduring long-term relationships. And to the extent we have them with different topics and groups, we are basically, I think, just have a better chance of appreciating all the things that need to be taken into consideration when we're trying to bring about social change. I see my good friend Judah, who has just joined in, and good to see you, Judah. And my time is about up with you folks, and I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of my experiences. And I want to thank you all for sharing with me your observations and questions, and your thoughts about what's important. Ultimately, I don't think there's many things more important than this topic, although it seems kind of dry and it seems kind of something that is cookie, kind of just a cookie cutter, and it should be very straightforward. And I think we all recognize it really isn't. So thank you, Chris, as well, for inviting me. It's a very special program that you have. The Society of Community Research in Action is really very fortunate to have you, Chris, that's devoting your time to kind of working on these types of important projects, to really train and help kind of get connected and help individuals who are early on in their careers as the scholars are here.
Lenny, before you leave, can you just make sure that you give hosting to Chris if possible, so that we all don't get bumped out of here?
I am going
Thanks, Peter.
to. So, I'm going to first